I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. It is my great good fortune to be sharing the stage with a couple of folks that I am extremely fond of. One, Anthony Marra, who we know is the author of Mercury Pictures Presents, which is why we're all here tonight, and Shannon DeVito, who's the director of books for Barnes & Noble, and one of my favorite colleagues. Shannon, why'd we pick Mercury Pictures Presents for the book club?
Well, how can I not, first of all, if you've all read it? It has everything that makes a movie brilliant and just goes so much deeper into detail in the cinematic scope of what it is, the way it's bookended, the cast of characters that I just fell in love with. I knew it had to be our book club. There's so much to discuss here, from the smallest character to Maria. I thought it was perfect.
Okay, Tony, before I get to you, because you know I have a ton of questions, how many people in the audience have read Constellation of Vital Phenomena? Okay. How many have you read The Tsar of Love and Techno? Oh, my people. Oh, my people.
We found our people.
I am a huge fan of the earlier books as well. And I have to say, Tony, and I know you and I talked about this when you were on the show, but historical fiction was an interesting choice for you. And it wasn't exactly what, and I'd heard that this book was coming and I knew you were doing something a little different, but from the artist perspective, how did we get here?
Yeah, it's well. First of all, thank you so much, Miwa and Shannon, for having me. Thank you all for coming out, for being joining us online. This has been just an amazing month. You know, I've received texts and pictures and Instagrams. Clearly, I'm not.
You're on it.
I am in the 21st century. From booksellers across the country, you know, gramming in their forthcoming book clubs at their local Barnes & Noble, and being a Barnes & Noble pick has just really meant the world to me. So thank you so much. The book began for me back in 2014, and my first two books were set in the former Soviet Union, and I felt that after doing two books there, I was ready to come in from the cold. And this particular period in LA history had always just really fascinated me, and I've always really loved research. And even though Constellation and Tsar aren't really historical fiction, they required a lot of research, and kind of the excuse to watch a bunch of old movies and call it work was too hard to resist. So as a novelist, you know, I came to this world in part as a way of expanding some of the larger themes and ideas that really captivated me, particularly with the Tsar of Love and Techno, in terms of how history gets revised, how we create political fantasies, and even though, you know, it seems at first glance that it would be difficult to find a place more geopolitically removed from Chechnya or the Soviet Union than Hollywood, it felt very much like another world where kind of anything can happen.
Yeah, and they're actually not that separate, but I'm going to warm us up a little more before we get there, because there's a lot in what you just said. But here's the thing. We've got a cast of Americans, some recent Americans, some not so recent Americans. You're writing about the landscape of exile, right? Let's talk about that for a second. You've got to ground this story in the people.
Yeah. So it was interesting. Originally it was just going to be Maria's story, and when I first envisioned the book, it was really I wanted to tell just a very linear, you know, sort of first person narrative, basically, and unfortunately I'm incapable of doing that. It's the character sort of, every time Maria would bump into somebody, every time that she a figure from her life sort of was introduced, they became kind of just so fascinating to me that I ended up veering into their perspective. So yeah, it one of the both the challenges and the joys of writing this book is that I wanted to sort of show how sort of all of these characters, who come from, very different backgrounds and in many cases very different countries, arrive at this one place, and how this kind of remarkable and unlikely group of people ended up, transforming American culture in the process of, trying to find a home.
Right. Shannon, do you have a favorite character?
So favorite main, definitely Maria,
yeah,
because
okay.
Maria is the best, because she's so brash and forceful and unafraid, but the guilt is so real. Also Italian American, how can I not? But honestly, it's actually some of the side characters. And one of the characters that stuck with me, and I know we've talked about how this is a spoiler discussion, but the water jug girl at the end, as she's viewing, that is a character, just how she was viewing something that she didn't fully, understand all of the players in the act, that stuck with her for the rest of her 70+ years of life. She was the character that again stuck with me after the entire book. With the beauty of this book is all of the chorus and cast of characters that you see the lens of these main characters through. So I loved all of them for different reasons, comic relief or heartbreak. They just each served a different purpose. So I'm curious if there was a side character you gravitated towards just personally, or that you liked writing more, and maybe they get their own little side story or book.
Yeah, it's interesting. So both the girl who has the water jug on her head at the end and the night watchman were two of my favorite kind of minor characters, because in both cases, the night watchman sort of watches Maria through the window as she's sort of reconstructing her father's letters. And in both cases, I was trying to figure out a way of depicting a very sort of like the emotional climax of of the first and the second halves of the book, in a way that that would create like just this slight bit of distance. Like I had tried writing it, both of those scenes, multiple times from sort of the perspective of both Maria and Vincent, and in both cases, I just kept on feeling like the writing was just getting a bit too melodramatic, and it was one of those things where I realized that the reader will know kind of all of the emotion that's buried there, and that if I just peel away for a moment and sort of show it through the perspective of somebody who's just walking past, who has no idea what the actual importance of that event is, that would be a way of kind of recentering those scenes in a new way. I kind of love the idea of novels that don't have minor characters, and this sense that kind of every character is the star of their own show, and that if the book turned a little bit differently at those points, we'd follow the watchman or the water jug girl, and that would be its own kind of story. And that for me, kind of in all my work, I think I'm fascinated with this idea of there not being minor characters.
Okay, but does that mean you're writing for story first, or are you writing for character first?
I guess I sort of see those as more or less the same.
Okay.
That the story emerges from the conditions of a character's experience in the world, and
Okay.
it feels that it's not a choice you're making, but rather those are two sort of inseparable qualities.
Which sets me up for the next question I want to ask, because you talk about how you map out stories, that you're not, I mean, you've mentioned research, but at the same time, you're really mapping out this world. And world building is a phrase that we tend to stick to when we're talking about science fiction or dystopian fiction or whatnot. But in fact, if you're writing historical fiction, you have to build this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. I think that if you're setting a novel in 2022 New York City, you're world building. Like world building, I think, is an intrinsic part of the writing process. But yeah, when you're setting something, whether it's in a dystopia or whether it's in the distant past, you can't rely as much on the reader's bringing their own sense of, the context. And so one of the things that as a writer I feel like I'm constantly looking for when I research are those small little moments that just seem almost unreal. So one example from this book was, somewhere along the line I read about these aviation plants that were transformed into sort of fake suburbs by Hollywood set designers in order to disguise them from any aerial attack. And that just seemed like one of those moments that, one of those little details that completely gives you a window into the world of these characters and the conditions of the period that they live within. And so those little moments and those little details to me feel much more important than, than having the right, the right palm tree in the right place, kind of.
Okay. But you've also talked about how you reshaped the book as you were learning new things about Hollywood, new things about Los Angeles. I mean, let's face it, people make assumptions about Los Angeles all the time. And the part-time Angelino has issues with that, but we're gonna stick to the book. I'm just saying there's more to LA than we often get credit for. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about that landscape. Let's talk about what it means. As you said, you're learning as you go. You're reworking entire neighborhoods. But one of the things you've got to deal with is race. This is World War II. It's Los Angeles. We have to talk about Eddie. We have to talk about Eddie Liu. And what you had to do as the creator of this character in this narrative, and frankly, as a white guy.
Yeah. So Eddie ended up becoming, his relationship with Maria, I think was my favorite, and to me feels like the most emotionally complicated and important of the book. I loved the I should say I've always had a tremendous trouble writing love stories. I just find that whenever I've tried them in the past, they too often veer into schmaltz, and writing sort of a romance that feels feels real and honest has always been tricky for me. And there's something about the way that that Eddie and Maria are both these outsiders in Hollywood, and that Eddie has, his family has been in the country for 80 years, but because of the racist typecasting that was so prevalent then, and in many ways continues today, he feels as much of an outsider, if not more so, than Maria and the various other exiles that he works with. And for me, like trying to Eddie, I think most deeply personifies and deals with a lot of like the moral contradictions that all of these characters face to one degree or another. And I think that the moment of the book that moved me the most is the very final pages with Eddie, when Maria gives him that her father's suitcase, and when he walks into Union Station for the first time, and is quite literally walking on the neighborhood that was demolished in order to make way for this, what now,
It's a perfectly lovely train station. I mean, if you have a chance, it's really attractive and it can get you lots of places, but it is where the old Chinatown sat.
And it's something that I feel like very few people, that Union Station, it is a beautiful train station, but the history of what was there before Union Station rarely gets spoken of when we talk about Union Station.
But that's also partially the function of movies, right? I mean, here's the thing. We're walking a line between art and propaganda. And we need to talk about the propaganda piece, because you have written a very timely historical novel about the rise of fascism.
Never a good sign. Is
Not
it?
your plan. I know this was not your plan. I know this was the result of a very bad case of writer's block, but dude, I mean, we have the book. You've written a really timely novel about the rise of fascism. Absolutely, entirely unintentionally. But it also starts with your own family, right?
Yeah. So I began working on this book in 2014, and at that point, Constellation and Czar both took around 2 years to write, and so I figured I would finish this up when Obama was still in office. Democracy is secure. None of the themes or ideas in this book are particularly relevant to to the world today. And Initially, when I was working on the book, I was juggling between sort of these two different directions that I could take, and one was to focus on Los Angeles, and one was to focus on Italy. And I sort of at the time saw them as two separate projects, and it wasn't until my wife and I took a vacation to Lipari, which is a beautiful island off the coast of Sicily, where my great grandmother's family emigrated from. And we were there and noticed this little plaque that was sort of drilled into the wall of this island citadel, which commemorated the various anti-fascists and artists and intellectuals who had been sentenced to internal exile there. And that was kind of the moment where I just began thinking about like the idea of what it means to be exiled within your own country, and how the conditions of the rise of fascism or just sort of any kind of political sort of reactionary forces can make certain communities feel like exiles in their own country. And that was sort of how I began thinking of Los Angeles and Italy, and the ways that in many ways during World War II in America's effort to defeat fascism, they began to put into place practices that in a lot of uncomfortable ways mirrored the very forces they were trying to defeat.
Well, and one of the things Shannon and I were talking about when she first chose the book too, is this idea that here is Maria living as an enemy alien. She's registered as an enemy alien because this is what happens when you're Italian American in Los Angeles during World War II. And here's her dad imprisoned, essentially, but in a way he almost has more freedom because he can wander around, he can go wherever he's going. She's limited in where she can travel and how she can travel. I mean,
yeah, in certain, so one of the and this is one of those things that as you're writing, you're always sort of like searching for those like little those resonances between characters or set pieces. And when I was when I first began working on the novel, the ways in which Maria and her father's experiences do kind of echo one another.
Right.
And Maria, strangely enough, in Los Angeles in the 40s, gets a better understanding of what her father had been going through than she would have had she remained in Rome. That was kind of a total surprise to me. And one of the things that I think I'm always looking for as a writer is for my characters to sort of upend my plans and to teach me something about the book that I didn't already know. And that was certainly one of those cases.
Hey, Shannon, what was the biggest surprise for you as you were reading? I mean, I know you really spent a lot of time with this and actually slowed down Shannon and I read really frighteningly fast because it's the only way we can do what we do. But you really sat and stayed. So there had to have been something that caught your attention and surprised you.
Yeah, it's always a flag for me when I slow down that I'm like, this is good. And it really was the cast of side characters. It was the lens and the breadth of all of the side characters that I just found myself immediately attached to, and I didn't know why. And I was like, when are we going to meet them again? Not necessarily side characters, but I do have to bring up the aunts.
Oh, yes.
Because their reverence and obsession with the patron saints but then the threatening tiny hammers when they don't feel like they're being listened to was just so indicative of Italian families. I was like, this is perfect. And I'd love to know, just, starting with Maria, but how did you build out the family around her? Did you already know what that structure would look like? Did they kind of start to pop up and you're like, oh, I'm gonna make them related?
Yeah, so they my own aunts are in the audience this evening,
Yay.
and Maria's aunts are based on their aunts. My great aunts Mimi, Lala, and Pep. I named them after my own great aunts, and in many ways, I think that they're very sort of fatalistic, very dark sense of existence, and inadvertently, often quite funny way of looking at the world was sort of directly drawn by them. And one of my so Mimi is the aunt that sort of plays the largest role in the novel, and my own great aunt Mimi was a piece of work, let's say. And poor Risha she suffered under under Mimi more than most. Yeah. She called the police on Risha after anyway. Yeah, that'll be in the follow-up, exactly. But no, so Mimi was somebody who she actually died when I began a couple years after I started working on this book. She was 98 years old, and she I sort of spent my entire childhood and up until my late 20s, early 30s. She was sort of the oldest person I knew. She was always the oldest person in any room. And she used to go to the Barnes and Noble in New Jersey, in sort of central New Jersey. I can't remember, where did she live? Little Falls, New Jersey. And
Yep.
she would take all of my books from wherever they were, and she would rearrange all of the placements at the front of the store, and she would proceed to hand sell my book by scolding customers who didn't buy it.
And we're very happy she did that.
Yeah.
I was about to say, no, won't be the last.
Yeah. But I think that speaks to the thread of humor that's throughout this entire book, that really, there are so many serious topics you address, but adding in the funny, I think, really is what makes it feel special and, not only cinematic, but approachable. So how did you make it funny?
Well, so it's interesting. I wrote them, even though I started this, in 2014. I ended up writing most of it in over the pandemic. That was when the bulk of it was written, and I found that that the book became weirdly this place where I was trying to create what felt sort of lacking in the world at large in that sort of rather grim period. And I would print out what I was working on every couple of weeks or every month or so, and I would show it to my wife, and I would go into the other room to because nothing is worse than trying to decipher the facial expressions of somebody.
Watching someone read.
Yeah. Oh, it's terrible. And I realized that I had finally hit the right tone when I could hear her laughing through the wall, and that kind of really set really made me rethink the general tone and tenor of the book. And I really did, particularly in that time period when it was pretty dark and bleak outside, to create this sort of ballast, this emotional ballast in my own life. And so many of these characters are living through rather tumultuous and uncertain times, and I realized that humor would be a way of both leavening that that seriousness and that somberness, but also was a way for them to kind of make sense of it. That a joke can be an articulation or an attempt to comprehend absurdity, and that's certainly what a lot of these characters are doing.
Mm-hmm. And it really, I think, goes back to reflecting that daily life of, even in the most serious of circumstances, you can approach something and talk to someone and there can be a joke in there, and it's okay. It's okay to laugh even when times are dark. So yeah, it makes it approachable.
And also the dialogue brings us to Artie.
Artie and his toupees.
I love Artie. I really do. Artie has his place in the world. We do have a question, though, from the audience, whether or not Artie is based on a real person, but I sort of feel like Artie's his own man.
I don't know what it says about me, but Artie was by far and away the easiest character to write.
I can see that.
He was just, I didn't even have to think. So Artie is definitely his own person. He and Ned are loosely inspired by Jack and Harry Warner,
right,
who had sort of a similarly difficult, shall we say, relationship, and the plot of the fortunes of Mercury Pictures as a business sort of roughly follows that of Warner Brothers in that era.
Okay, this brings me to another question from the audience. So there were so many amazing nuggets of historical information that you wove into this plot. Where do you draw the line between imagination and fiction and historical representation?
That's a very thorny question. So I my own feeling is that everything, the biggest pieces need to be accurate and real, and not only like the largest elements, but the most sort of fantastical elements in the book have to be real. And I find that it's in the more intimate, more sort of everyday moments that I feel the license to invent more. But kind of everything of historical note that is represented in the book happened.
I think I forgot to tell you that I bought a copy of the WPA Guide to Los Angeles in the 30s because of you.
It's so good, isn't it?
Really, I did. So we're chatting and whatnot, and I love my city, and my city is very groovy, but I had never, and I have a WPA Guide to Massachusetts, which is where I grew up. And I love this kind of stuff, right? Because also the WPA Guides, if you don't know, they were written in the moment. And we're trying to capture history as it's happening. And so to see Los Angeles unfold, sort of ridiculously many decades later, it's really kind of exciting.
Yeah,
there's some good stuff in there. There's some very good stuff. It
is just like a treasure trove for a novelist.
Okay, so you've done the research, you've found the people, you've given them the very snappy dialogue. All right, I'm not Mildred's only fan, right? Tell me there are other fans of Mildred in this audience, please, because I love that woman. And the fact that she can look at Artie and just be like, you did that. You said that. Okay. And just seeing her swan around in the first, I may have had an Aunt Mildred who was not dissimilar to Mildred, and that might be part of my fondness for this character, but she keeps them grounded. And that's one of the things I love, is you never let your characters go so far afield where they become caricatures. Artie sending money into the world, not knowing where his sister is. He's sending money to the sister in Europe, who ultimately we find out has not been getting this money. And so he's not a buffoon. He's a guy who cares. He's hiring all of these exiles in Los Angeles. And you had a great line about Hollywood being the Siberia of the West.
Oh, sunny Siberia.
Okay,
yeah.
Can we talk about that for a second? Because I don't want Artie to get short shrift here.
No, so Artie was definitely the most fun for me to write. And one of the things that I really enjoyed, so one of the things in general I think that I was trying to play around with in the book is just the very idea of types. And in some ways, when we are first introduced to Artie, just in the first couple of beats, he does seem a bit like a type in terms of being this, bombastic Hollywood producer. But then about 10 pages in, you realize that, in fact, this is a sort of an act that he is putting on in order to leverage his negotiating power with some bankers. And he, as a character, I feel like he is so attuned to the fact that life is sort of a series of presentations and how we present ourselves, and he is I think is incredibly an incredibly interesting character in terms of like what it means to use people's presumptions to your own advantage, and I think that's something that Maria certainly learns from him over the course of the novel as well.
And he lets Maria do what she needs to do, so she ends up in a very good place because Artie has a big soul. He has a big heart. And he's not going to let her be a secretary. And, you know, we're talking about a time in American history where women were not necessarily pushed to the front of the line. And I really appreciated the fact that this could happen in this place, but it happens because Artie is a stand-up guy.
Sort of, yeah, beneath it all, he absolutely is. He is sort of strangely one of the like moral centers of the novel.
Ned is not.
I was going to bring up
Ned,
then
Ned is not.
the dichotomy of how did you know that then Ned was going to be essentially the villain? The villain in my mind.
Well, he went to Dartmouth, so
and that sealed the deal.
Yeah. No, so I'm not sure again what this says about my family dynamics, but sort of Cain and Abel have appeared in a number of my books. So it's sort of that idea of, you know, two bickering brothers who sort of are in many ways very similar and are rupturing their family. It sort of reappears in a number of guises, kind of in all three of my books. And there's something I think that that is really profound about the way so many of these studios in the golden age of Hollywood were family businesses, and very few of those families ended in a better place than they started in terms of their own family culture, and the ways in which sort of money and power and just the, you know, great terrible machine of American capitalism in general has warped Artie and Ned's relationship. I feel like is indicative of how so many of those Hollywood families were really torn apart by the businesses they created.
Okay, we have two more questions from the audience that I want to work in here because I want to know too. Is this being adapted for the screen, whether large or small? That's a lot of questions about whether or not this is being adapted. So
I don't know. We'll see.
Okay,
we will
all right,
see.
that's fair. And then, do you have any plans for a sequel?
Oh, I don't know. I
sort of don't feel like there's one there, but
Yeah.
I'm asking the question.
I'm not sure. So one of the things that that I really liked with Constellation and Czar was the sense of having these two books that weren't directly related, but were sort of in conversation loosely. So maybe either the next book or somewhere down the line there would be a book that would be somehow in conversation. But I feel like the stories of these characters have kind of reached their end.
There's plenty of space for new conversations too, and new stories about Los Angeles. So, you know, feel free. Please feel free. We have time for maybe one more question before we get to the signing part of things, but I want to talk about literary influences for a second. I mean, there's some folks who've compared you to Amor Towles, and there's a little bit of Sarah Blake's The Guest book in this. I know you've talked about influences like Edward P. Jones and David Mitchell, and I mean, you read as broadly as a bookseller, which is, you know, we like that. But let's talk about some of the sources beyond the WPA guide, which, by the way, seriously, it's really fun. It really is like endless amounts of fun. And I may have also picked up the one for New York City while I was at it, but anyway, these things happen. But let's talk about the books that helped make you the guy who created this.
Yeah, so in general, I think that the writer that I probably go back to the most is maybe Zadie Smith. There's something about both the way she uses this sort of very broad, omniscient perspective. She's somebody who I feel like cannot write a flat minor character, and the way that like her narrative tone of voice, which has this wonderful, particularly in her first couple books, has this wonderful arch quality that I think is certainly I was trying to channel in Mercury. So she's somebody who is hugely important. In general for this book, Jennifer Egan, Jess Walter, Beautiful Ruins, I absolutely loved, and obviously he does Hollywood and Italy quite well himself. I don't know. I find though that it's often I'm often like just picking up like little things, little techniques from kind of a whole variety of books. Like one of the novels that I was thinking about a lot when I was working on this was A Fine Balance, in terms of sort of using several novella length sections that then leads into one sort of longer continuous sort of second half of a book. So it's kind of, I think the value of reading as a writer is that it's kind of teaching you what to do and how to go about this.
Shannon, what do you want listeners to know about Mercury Pictures?
I was just gonna ask you actually what you wanted readers to take away, but what I think, honestly, what I would want readers or listeners, and hopefully everyone's read this, and if you haven't, please do yourself a favor. It is so worth the time and experience of meeting all of these characters. Is if you're standing in front of someone and they're holding your book, what is the one thing you'd want them to take away from it? Because there's so many layers, and what I would take away from it is it's okay to laugh and it's okay to cry and it's okay to think about historical experiences in a new light. What would you tell them?
Can I actually say that this happened?
Oh, good.
A couple weeks
Great.
ago, I was on I was on an Amtrak going back to New Haven, and I was sitting in my seat, and I looked across the aisle, and there was a man who was reading Mercury Pictures Presents. And I introduced myself, and I'm going to be speaking at his book club in a couple of weeks, and he's even here tonight.
Lucky train man. Lucky train man.
But I don't think I said what I hoped you got out of it. I don't know. I don't know what I feel like it's I hope that that readers will have the sense of being transported. I feel like as a reader, that's the thing that I value perhaps most. And while I was writing this book, that was it felt to me like this teleportation, machine in a period in which I was otherwise, landlocked. And so I hope that readers will have that sense of being transported into a time and a place that at first glance may seem, very different from their day-to-day life, but that nonetheless speaks in a deep way to some of the larger issues and themes and divisions that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, and human connection. Just the way all of the characters interact with each other really, I think, reflects what we do every day.
Just connect. Just connect. And speaking of connect, I did promise we would hand the stage back so we could do a book signing for all of this. So before I let everyone go, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Shannon. It is always good to see you guys. I've missed. I get to see her every day.
I don't count.
I get to see her constantly. And I did promise the store that I would mention we have Dar Williams coming up for How to Write a Song That Matters on Saturday, September 10th at 7 p.m. We have Emily Radzikowski. Her paperback of My Body is September 14th here at 7 p.m. More details can be found on bn.com. Please tell me I have that right, store. Yes, Kelly is giving me the thumbs up, so hurrah. Our September book club pick is out. It is called Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen. It's pretty groovy. If magical realism is your thing, we would love love to see you online in October. I believe it's October 4th. Those details are definitely on bn.com. That is probably also online only. So if that's easier for folks, well, we're happy to see you. And I don't know which camera I'm looking at, so sorry. Anyway, thank you all for joining us tonight. I am so happy to see Anthony's family. This is really groovy. It's always nice to meet everyone's olds. Anyway, thank you again. This has been fantastic. And thank you for being part of the Barnes & Noble Book Club.
Thank you, Anthony.